for taking the time to have this discussion today.
Looking forward to it.
I've familiarized myself with a lot of your work, primarily Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, and I've listened to your much of your series with a good friend of mine, Robert Breedlove. And man, first of all, just kudos for being able to distill what seems to be a lifetime worth of education, contemplation, and experience into coherent insights directed toward trying to contribute to perhaps the most worthwhile cause there is, which is figuring out how we should be engaging reality, for lack of a more all-encompassing term. So thank you for the work that you've done thus far.
Well, thank you for saying that. Yeah, yeah. Your way of representing it is, yeah, quite accurate. Daunting. I just need to make sure something here. Sorry. Just realized that my son unplugged my power cord. So, yeah, and so it's a daunting series. I understand that, because when people first see it as 51-hour episodes, wow. But it's because it represents exactly what you're saying there. It represents an attempt to distill basically 20 years worth of academic scientific work, even more personal transformation and personal experience, into like you say, a coherent argument for addressing, I think, one of the most plausible explanations as why we're in so much trouble and why we're finding it so difficult to get out of that trouble. And that's what I call the meaning crisis. So thank you for saying that. It's very much appreciated, John.
Well, I'm hoping so to contextualize this conversation, and what I think is most worthwhile or useful at the time is we'll just tackle whichever components of this that feel like, that resonate with us most. And we won't try to rush through anything. And if it's the case that we need to have another conversation in the future, your time and willingness permitting, of course, then we can find a way to do that. Because these are topics that clearly you and more recently myself and others have been grappling with. And again, I mean, it may be the case that there's nothing more important to try to grapple with and understand and come to terms with. And so I want to make sure we do it justice and not just try to fit it into, certain time constraints that might be, transient or what have you. So, I mean, maybe the best place to start, and there's so many different places we could start that it's kind of challenging, but the series Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, and as you just said, I mean, there seems to be a type of crisis in meaning, and this is manifesting in culture and in individuals' lives and pretty much everywhere all around the world. Or at least that's the assertion that you have made, and I largely agree with. Can you define or characterize what you mean by that? And then we can see what we roll into.
Yeah, again, 50 hours to try and do that. But I appreciate, first of all, before I get into it, I want to thank you for the invitation to careful thought. As you can imagine, sometimes I've drawn into, much less frequently than initially, can you summarize this in 5-10 minutes for, I generally don't even like to answer requests to appear on the radio, because that's typically what happens. Right. So first of all, I want to express appreciation. And if this conversation goes as well as I foresee it will, I'd be happy to come back and have another one if we feel it's needed.
Fantastic.
The meaning crisis, there's different ways of getting into it. One way I can do is talk about what I mean by meaning and why it's fallen into kind of an abeyance, a lack, a hunger. Another is I can talk about the symptoms of that, how it's expressed in culture. So I think the best thing would be to dip into both of those, try to give the gist of both of those as quickly as possible. So the basic idea is, what is meaning? Well, meaning is actually generated by a process of how we are trying to fit ourselves cognitively and sociomotor interaction with the world. It's very much analogous to biological fittedness for an organism, how evolution shapes the organism. But if you pay more careful attention, as we have nowadays, it's actually niche construction. The organism shapes the environment shapes the organism until they belong together, they fit together. And what opens up is what are called affordances. Affordances are these real relations of fittedness. So this is from Gibson. Like, for example, this bottle is graspable by me. It being graspable is not a property of the bottle. Not everything can grasp it. The graspability isn't a property of me. I can't grasp Africa or Mars. It's a real relation for real interaction so that real problem solving and real goal attainment can occur. So that kind of evolving dynamic connectedness of your sensory motor loop to the world is sort of the core of meaning. And you can feel that evolution right now in your attention. Let me just try and give you an example of how it's working. So part of what your brain is doing is it's trying to open up and vary your attention. And right. And if you sort of give into that impulse, you'll start mind wandering and you'll drift away. And you can feel that pull right now, and me mentioning it, right? And by the way, that's not maladaptive. And then there's a count. So think about that like evolution. That's introducing variations of what you could pay attention to. Now, you don't want to open that up too much because the amount of things you could pay attention to is overwhelming. So what do? You try and select down to, okay, but what right now is giving me relevant information for moving closer to or achieving my goal? And then what you're constantly doing is this all the time. Sometimes it goes very rapidly. You'll break out of a frame and come back in. That's insight. Often it's happening much more sort of like a textured salience gradient, like how things are standing out to you, backgrounding. So this is not cold calculation I'm talking about. This is your lived connectedness. It's about what grabs your attention, but also what is obvious to you, what your attention ignores and what you're oblivious to. And all of that is constantly shifting and evolving in a very complex way. Now, that's actually central to your agency. That's your connectedness. You have sort of three dimensions: how you're connected to yourself, and this is sort of your mind body into action, how you're connected to other people. So you and I are constantly trying to improve the relevant information we're sending to each other if we're trying to communicate. And then how I or we are connected to the world. These are all these vibrant connections. Now, here's the thing. These are so inherently valuable to you because they are constitutive, they constitute, they found and continually create your very cognitive agency. You can't be a person unless you're a cognitive agent, and you can't be a cognitive agent unless you're making these kinds of ongoing, living, evolving connections. So that's what, and so when you take a look at the meaning in life literature, what you see is what people value or what they even claim contributes to the sense of how meaningful their lives are is how much, not again they believe, but how much they actually experience this connectedness. A prototypical instance of feeling that connectedness in all three of those dimensions, potentially really enlivened and enriched for you, is the flow state. The flow state is when that evolving connectedness gains a kind of power. I could argue about it more in depth that's because you're actually enhancing in that flow state the conditions of good adaptive connectivity. So that's the meaning. And then the thing that needs to be said are 2 points. One, most of that meaning making in the sense of this dynamic sensory motor connectedness is not carried by your propositional beliefs. It's carried by your skills, your states of mind, and your traits of character. But we as a culture have tended to orient primarily at the level of our propositional beliefs, and we have let wither away the kinds of practices that help us to engage that meaning-making machinery. Now that means we start to lose the experience of enhancing it. But there's even a more insidious problem, which is those very mechanisms that make you adaptively fit, give you this sense of connectedness and meaning in life, make you perennially prey to self-deception. You know this because what happens is what often that machinery that makes things obvious to you. It's obvious that I should have said that. And then you realize, oh, I shouldn't have said that. That was exactly the wrong thing to say. So the problem is that machinery can't, what it does is it selects out of all the information you could pay attention to a very small subset. Most of the time it's doing that very well, but every time you do it, you're gambling that that's the right choice. And sometimes the gamble is wrong and you make the wrong things salient. You pay attention in the wrong way. You think, well, the way she was holding her hand, it was obvious that she's angry at me. No, she's not angry at you at all. She's reaching out to you in love, and you just misframed the situation completely. We know that. So those very framing processes that fit us to reality and give us meaning in life also make us subject to self-deception. Most of it's not carried in terms of our propositional beliefs, but at the level of our skills, states of mind, traits of character. So what cultures across time, context, and history have done have created ecologies of practices for trying to ameliorate the self-deceptive, self-destructive behavior and enhance the meaningful connectedness. The word for that is wisdom. And so one way of taking all of that and epitomizing it is to saying our culture is impoverished in affording people the individual and collective, and both of those are important, by the way, cultivation of wisdom. And wisdom is not optional. If you are not addressing your self-deceptive, self-destructive behavior, it is going to percolate through your psyche and permeate through your life and take on a life of its own until it sucks the life out of your life. If you don't have strategies for enhancing connectedness, you'll feel that life is flat. You're not very connected to it. You're alienated. It strikes you often as absurd or futile. We put those two together and people are in despair. Foolishness and that flatness, that's despair. That's where we are. Mm-hmm. How was that? That was the first half.
That was excellent. You know, it seems to me, attention requires commitment, or you could say attention is necessarily exclusionary. And so the game at play here, let's say, is to try to enhance the degree to which your attention is excluding the right things and focusing on giving attention to the quote unquote right things or the best things. And as you say, I mean, if you every time you commit, you're gambling in a sense, because you're saying, well, this is what I'm committing to, the thing that's most salient or relevant or good, at the exclusion of other things, and maybe that's a mistake. And as I think I agree with you that these practices, be they religious or otherwise, throughout time have been developed and put in place emergently or intentionally to try to aid in that process, that dynamic process of making sure that you're committing your attention to the best place you can, such that you have the best experience of life, let's say, as an individual and as part of a harmonious collective, or an optimally harmonious collective, something like that. Why do you think that we are in this position today? We have a legacy of thousands of years of these belief systems being integral to the development of civilization. And, it would seem that they are competitively or advantageous, because all of the, at least recorded ancient history that we have, they've always been central to those civilizations. And it seems like those have been the primary enterprises of those civilizations. And now we've reached a time, and I referenced this at the beginning of my piece, where we've seemingly done away with the enterprise, or a lot of people have done away with the enterprise of religion, and to maybe a lesser degree, the seriousness with which they take, broadly speaking, quote unquote, spirituality, out of perhaps a sense of, that it's unnecessary, or not recognizing the value or function of it. Or maybe even, perhaps an illusion of progress, which I'd like to dig into with you, as we go. But what is it that you think has caused us to wind up in the situation that you just described?
Well, there's sort of two types of factors. One are historical factors in which people have continually played around with the machinery of our worldview in order to try, I think, to enhance or improve it. But as you said, it's a gamble. That's why we say paying attention. We're spending our most precious resources of time and our own cognitive agency.
Right.
So, and those gambles have sometimes had unintended side effects. In fact, that's part of what's called the frame problem. In addition to whatever you intend as the consequence of your behavior, there are always a proliferation of unintended side effects. And so it's always possible, again, for things to go off. So one perennial problem we fall into is we try to, we get utopic. In a particular sense, I'm going to mean, we can set the utopia in the past and be nostalgic, or we can set it in the future and be what's typically meant by utopic today, because we have this future-oriented sense of value. But what do I mean by that? And this overlaps with sort of the biblical. I'm not Jewish or Christian or a Muslim, but I take the Bible seriously. The biblical idea of idolatry, and this is what I mean. We can get into the place where we think we can complete this. We can finish it. We can remove the chances. We can remove the uncertainty, the gamble. We can finish it. We can complete it. We can perfect it. I consider myself a follower of Plato, but this is one part of Plato that I tend to criticize. Right. So what does that mean? What does that mean? Let me try and go back to the analogy I used. If I was to say to you, hey, look, this is how evolution works. Evolution is constantly, right, redesigning and redefining from itself what it is, what it means for a creature to be fitted long enough that it can survive to reproduce. And, you know, it could mean the creature's big or small, fast or slow, hard or soft, single cell, like, and you go, oh, wow, wow. And then you can say, but what's the final form? What's the form that I can get? So if that creature has that form, that species will never go extinct and evolution is no longer needed. And the biologist is going to turn to you and say, no, I don't think you're understanding this. There can't be a final form. There is no final form of life. Like evolution is a defining feature of life because life is trying to continually fit itself to a never-ending, ceaselessly changing environment. That's always going to take you by surprise and always going to be complex beyond the limitations of your cognition. There is no final form, but you can get to the where you think, now we have it. Now we have it, right? And so you can see this tension within, right? Even within religion, right? Because religion is trying to do two things. It's trying to home us against the horror of this reality that can be so vast, right? And then when that goes too far, we've got it. We've got the perfect walls. We've got the perfect edifice. We've got the perfect structure. Now just come in here and you will forever be safe, right? And you can see that. But then there's another tendency that says, no, don't do that, right? So, you know, you can think of this as maybe like the priest and the temple, but you've got the prophet in the wilderness saying, no, wilderness, God is numinous. You got to remember that you're going to get slammed if you're not paying it, right? And you can see that tension. And when religions are doing it well, they get an optimal grip between this. They're constantly shifting between homing and exposing people to the horizon of horror, right? And what we lost is we for various reasons, historical reasons, we got locked into a framework where we got locked into our propositions. We forgot our skills, our procedures. We forgot our perspectives, that is our states of mind. We forgot our participatory knowing, our character traits, right? And we gave great emphasis to belief. And then we figured, you know what we can do? We can get closure on that. We can build perfect structures of thought that have absolute certainty. This is the Cartesian project. As soon as you're locked into that, and what happened is that started to take priority. It got separated, right, from the recognition of the perennial problems of self-deception and disconnection. I'm trying to summarize a lot of history here in a very brief moment, but we got locked into this framework where, right, we were beset by the promise of closure and certainty. And I mean, you can see it's an intoxicating, it's an intoxicating thing. But what we've realized is we can't. And for, whatever criticisms people have of postmodernism shouldn't be treated as a homogeneous thing. There's different thinkers, different arguments. But the two I know fairly well, Derrida and Foucault, what they're basically pointing to, and by the way, the same thing comes out of American pragmatism through James and others, is like, no, that quest for closure and certainty, that's not viable, right? How relevant, how salient information is never perfectible. What you most are trying to get is to make it most evolving, most self-corrective as it can possibly be. And so we're locked into a very bad place. What is this has given us is the following, and then I'll shut up and let you start. We have, because of the Cartesian revolution, we're situated in a certain way. We have a scientific worldview that's giving us explanations of all these things, of everything we turn our mind to, like Descartes promised. But what it can't do is give a scientific explanation of science. I mean, the entity, the practice, the relevance realization, truth-seeking, meaning-making processes that generate the very possibility and the ongoing practice of science are not well explained by science itself. So we do not fit into the worldview, and yet we are taught to hunger for a closed, certain worldview and to find certainty within it. That's a disaster. That's a disaster for a worldview.
Right. As I quote Peterson largely throughout the piece, and I open with, highlighting what I derive from a reading of Maps of Meaning. And I do think it's one of the great books of our time, and perhaps will become a timeless work. But, he's been prolific in helping, in presenting an interpretation of the Judeo-Christian faith primarily to broad audiences. And, as you're saying that, it makes me think of the point he makes, or the function that he attributes to the regenerative hero, which is there's these two eternal forces, right? The chaos of the unknown, novelty, entropy, however you want to describe it, and the known, right? The familiar structures, safety, conformity, all that kind of stuff. And when I'm hearing you speak, it seems like the scientific revolution, let's say, has maybe caused us to lean too heavily into the latter, and not account sufficiently for the former. And furthermore, maybe even do away with the function of the intermediary between the two, the one that's supposed to help mediate back and forth, because as you say, it's a never-ending circumstance that we find ourselves in. The nature of the circumstance will never change. The attributes of the varying circumstances obviously will, but the broader nature of that circumstance will never change. And I think it seems to me that at doing away with what we may falsely, or in some cases perhaps, let's put it this way, doing away with religions as silly, naive superstitions, or emblematic of primitive cultures, or however you want to characterize them, such that you can dismiss them more easily. An appreciation for the maybe even primacy of that intermediary function has been dismissed along with it. And I believe that you've articulated this in Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, and many have alluded to this, that when you lose the maybe primacy of that idea, value, or function, what takes its place? And it seems like, this will be an oversimplification, but either a kind of narcissism in which the individual is ascendant to the primary place, and there's nothing to, let's say, submit or subordinate yourself to, even if that's just in the sense of submitting yourself or subordinating yourself to a certain value or values by which to orient your behavior. Or if we're talking culturally and not necessarily individually exclusively, then perhaps you could make an argument, and many do, and it's probably overly simplified, but I think there's validity to it, where the state ends up kind of assuming the role of the primary ordering force or something like that. So, yeah, I mean, do you think that's a credible explanation, or what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that was very well said. I thought that was very well said. Let me sort of riff and respond to a couple of the salient features.
Sure.
One is, notice how, just drop into your own phenomenology, the careful reflection on the structures that make your experience meaningful, and you'll find your sense of realness has this tonos. This is a Greek word for like a creative tension. One sense of realness is, what is real? Well, that which is most confirmed. Look, and notice I'm using my hands to gesture, confirm, drawing in, like you're building this structure. This is the homing. This is reality, is that which most homes me, and right, and that's why there's an aspect of realness that overlaps with familiarity. And then think about what how the word family is in there, right? Okay, right, and then, but we have another sense of realness, which is the opposite. Oh, the real is that which surprises me, which is counterintuitive, which I didn't expect, because that can't be a product of my bias, right? That has to be coming from the world, because of the way it's smashed through the brickwork of my bias so powerfully. And we have this in the scientific experimentation. We look for confirming evidence, but we try to make it open to disconfirmation, etc. We're trying to loop the self-corrective loop. We're trying to optimize. I think, by the way, that what the process of meaning making, relevance realization, is about optimally gripping, like you said, between those two, between home and horror. And the sacred is exactly the sense of getting an optimal grip on that in a most comprehensive way, I would argue. And so if you throw out the sacred function, you're basically taking this process that is constantly self-correcting and evolving, and you're basically like you're lobotomizing it, and it's just gonna gravitate. And I think you're exactly right. What you're going to get is narcissism, and a lot of what passes for spiritual but not religious, not all, but a lot, is exactly the religion of me. That's what people say when they're spiritual. They say, I mean, and this is not just my view, this is a view of sort of academics studying the spiritual but not religious. What it often means is the religion of me. Now that can have a healthy aspect to it. I think the project, Kierkegaardian project, the Socratic project of knowing yourself, can be legitimate and authentic. Authenticity is also a equivocal term, but there's also, I think you're right, there's a prevalent narcissistic form of this, and it leads to all kinds of self-deceptive behavior. Just one example is spiritual bypassing, the religion of me, and having wonderful experiences that I can put on the shelf of my autobiography and look at how wonderful I am, and you're just bypassing your moral and existential responsibilities to the world and to other people. Spiritual bypassing, it's a studied phenomena, legitimately so. The opposite end of the, like, once these get pulled apart, yes, and then you got pseudo-religious ideologies. This is exacerbated by the fact that we think our propositions are what's central about us. This is what I call propositional tyranny, and our ideas. Right, and what we do is we try to we'll configure the perfect system of ideas. That's an ideology, and it will take the place of all the transformations at the procedural and the perspectival and the participatory level that you normally have to undergo when you cultivate wisdom. Instead, all you need to do is believe and adhere to and assert the system of ideas that is closed, that is perfect, that can deal with all situations, interpret every aspect of reality. And you get the pseudo-religious ideologies, and they smash the world. They smash the world. We gave them fairly free rein in the first half of the 20th century, and they drenched the world in blood, right? So another way of thinking of the meaning crisis is people are trapped between these, right? People don't find the existing religions viable, because the existing religions, well, I have to be careful here. For many people, not for all people. I want to be really careful about that, because I think there are people who still find genuine meaning and wisdom cultivation in religion. But for the nuns, the NONESs, one of the fastest growing demographic groups, those people who have no allegiance to any established religion, right? They face They face this problem. The traditional religions don't seem viable. They don't seem like they can do that work of homing them against the world and also taking them to the horizon of wonder and awe. It doesn't do that for them. And that's why they say, sorry, if you want to do that, that's fine, but that's not for me. And then they're caught between these two poles, and they can drift, especially if they're doing it autodidactically, into the narcissistic religion of me and all of its problems. But so a lot of them see that and they sort of pull away, and then they can, some people can get drawn into the various pseudo-religious ideologies of the right and of the left. I don't see any deep historical difference between their capacity to drench the world in blood, right? And then they're caught in between. Right? And so you get all these weird symptoms of the meaning crisis. You get, right, that suicide is going up amongst this generation, and the age at which suicide is being attempted is dropping. You're now having children committing suicide, even in places of significant affluence like Silicon Valley, right? You're getting loneliness, mental health issues, anxiety disorders, depressive disorders, addiction, which is ultimately about this loop getting narrow and tight, and what Mark Lewis calls reciprocal narrowing and binding you down. There's the attempt to escape into the virtual world and replace all of this real connectedness with connections. I have 17 likes. I have 1,500 friends on Facebook, all that kind of stuff, right? But you see positive symptoms too. You see, right, although I have criticisms of it, you see the mindfulness revolution, the revival of Stoicism. You see all these emerging discourses, all these new communities of practice, people trying to integrate movement, mindful movement, all the emergence of dialogical practices like circling and like all of this stuff. So you can see all of this attempt, both what you might call the negative reactive symptoms that Chris Masterpietro and I talked about. You can also see the positive responses, because they're like, I don't want to go over there because the state, and there's so much political, there's polarization and bullshit, and it's just become so corrupted. And then, but if I go over here, I've met people that they're so lost in their own narcissism, and what do I do? What do I do? That's another way of understanding the meaning crisis.
Yeah, well, I think crisis is probably a good word for it. And, when I hear you say those words, I think even though we don't act upon it necessarily as a panic, but, all those things that you just referred to, like this emergence of popularity or interest in Stoicism or different forms of spiritual practices, or like people are very much kind of just putting their arms out, maybe with their eyes, only half open, and being like, where can I derive that meaning from? That hole that's been left vacant or void for a while, or that I've been conditioned and brought up in a world that didn't fill it properly. How can I fill it? And one of the biggest tells for me, and this is obviously somewhat critical, but when you engage with people today who maybe are quote unquote ideologically possessed, or you can feel and hear and see their degree of certainty. That's the biggest tell that they've kind of given up on that mediatory process, right?
Yes.
And that, and I think that's changing. I think it's changing rapidly. And back to that whole point of, and one of the reasons why I brought up the validity of the religious enterprise, let's say in the piece that I wrote, is because I think it's the reason why it's been so integral to, pretty much every civilization we have records of in some capacity, it takes different shapes, but is because it's like that dynamic process of let's say salience or relevance finding or honing in our attention that we discussed before. It seems like, and you're referring to like what people hold up as kind of the highest. I mean, what you hold up as the highest value, what you pray to, what you subordinate yourself to, what that will become what orders your behavior, right? And that will dictate very much that dynamic process of determining where your attention falls. And as a result, I think that's probably been, broadly speaking, in my opinion, the enterprise of religions. Now, of course, humans are corruptible, and people take things overly literally, and institutions grow up around these things, and everyone's power hungry. And I think this is part of the reason why they degenerate, or at least their initial purpose is obfuscated, and then people end up being attached to these institutions, and there may be some value still in what they're able to convey and steward, but it seems like it's cut off from, the purity of the enterprise as it was initially started, something like that.
That's
And
well
I
said.
wonder,
That's very well said.
thank you. I wonder if this is always the process, because as we just said, I mean, everything is constantly in flux. So you're
Yes.
never going to get an orientation that is once and for all mapped to that dynamic process. It's constantly in flux. And we could probably look at that on every scale. And if we look
Yep.
at it, I think back to cavemen, for example, and, the earliest, let's say it's 40,000 years ago or whatever the date may be.
Transition, yeah.
And we have, people outlining their hands on cave walls. And then we have like therianthropic figures being painted.
Yeah,
And this
yeah,
seems like the process
Yes.
of
yes,
people coming to grips with their own selfness, their own self-awareness, right? And then
yes,
this generates the initial landscape of what you might call culture, right? We're kind of
Yes.
creating this feedback loop into what we are and what we create and how that just accelerates
Yes,
and informs us.
yes,
And as a result of that, the landscape with which we are communicating, which is conditioning us, and that feedback loop is constantly changing, right? And
Yes.
it's reflecting back to us, and it's also hopefully serving as a mechanism for novelty to come through the chaos of pure potential and be somewhat contextualized enough so that we can grapple with it
yes,
in the proper way and integrate it properly. But it seems like we're back to that balance where the usefulness and the utility of that process or that feedback loop or that culture gets, maybe its success is such that you become accustomed to it, or you take it for granted, or you rely on it too much. And therefore you are less receptive to, or you're cut off to the novelty aspect of it that's supposed to revivify and regenerate it. And of course, this is, again, the idea of the regenerative hero in a lot of myth and story. But the point that I'm trying to make here is, it seems like our landscapes of meaning, if we can broadly refer to culture in that way, are continuously expanding. And so let's say the approach to the ultimate orienting value by which to mediate that dynamic process of the caveman seems like it is very different from the one of the early Christian, for example, or you might even say different in terms of its complexity from, Göbekli Tepe, people 10,000 BC. And then, those would be somewhat less complex or sophisticated than those of the 5,000, the Egyptians, and then of the Christians, and so on and so forth. And so do you think there's any validity to the notion that part of the reason why we fell out of the proper appreciation for that orientation or that mechanism is because we're once again, culture has been given a few thousand years to expand the meaning landscape. And now the meaning landscape is no longer properly fitted for the orientation mechanism. And what's happening is one is being changed out for another one that needs to emerge to become fit once again for and in the latter part of my piece, I make the case that digital worlds that are emerging now are just, the cultural process in another domain, and dramatically accelerating that feedback loop and the possibility contained therein, because it's basically limitless, the possibilities. So do you think that, and then my final point, and then I'll let you riff on this, but is there an argument? I'll put it this way. It's obvious that cultural institutions and the de facto or default conditioning and education and knowledge that we derive simply from being in a culture and all the things we pick up as a result of that contributes greatly to the consciousness and the awareness that we have. For example, if you and I were born, the example I often use is in like a tribe in the Amazon rainforest. Our preferences would be different, our understandings would be different, our worldview, all these different things, so it seems like the consciousness that we have available to us, even though physiologically may not be different than the cave people 45,000 years ago, but in practice, or the awareness that is generated from that physiological substrate is vastly different. And so are we going through an accelerated process of what type of consciousness is available to us, and is this waxing and waning of this mediatory value or orientation between chaos and order, broadly speaking, is that just part of the evolution of consciousness taking place, something like that?
It was a pleasure listening to you. You're eloquent in your articulation and the formulation of questions. Let me try and pick up on some of the threads and hopefully weave them back into the conversation. So I think it's very much the case that we have, I refer to it as a cultural cognitive grammar. We have structures of intelligibility that we've deeply internalized, that, like a grammar limits how you can put things together and make sense. And so we have a limited vocabulary, a conceptual vocabulary. We're given a set of concepts and then a grammar for how we can put them together, right? And so, for example, one more way to think, we internalize it so deeply that it becomes transparent to us. Like, I often use the metaphor of the lenses of my glasses. They're transparent to me because I'm seeing beyond them and by means of them. And so, for example, we have this grammar of subjectivity and objectivity, and of them being incommensurable with each other, totally different domains. And it's a mystery of how they could possibly interact. And then we vacillate between asserting the importance of objectivity or subjectivity, because we make a sort of absolute dichotomy and say there's no way of explaining how they interact. And so we vacillate between prioritizing one over the other. And we think this is sort of the way reality is, right? Because we have, I'm just using this as an example. We have these two terms of conceptual vocabulary: subjectivity, objectivity, and then we have this grammar. They are complete and exclusive and exhaustive and incommensurable with each other. And then we're bound between positivism and romanticism and empiricism and rationalism, and we do all that, right? What we forget is that's historical. It's not the case that that is natural to human beings. We can even look in our own history where that division is not understood or even experienced by people. You can just look back before, basically the rise of nominalism and the scientific revolution. You look into the Christian Neoplatonic tradition, or you look at other cultures throughout the world, look at Taoism. Like that dichotomy is not there. Many people have noted that, but what people haven't noted is, yes, but that tells you how powerful these cultural cognitive grammars can be. So there is definitely that, and that's because we are faithful to culture, right? Like you said, we commit to, right, we commit simultaneously to this particular worldview and the conceptual vocabulary and the cognitive cultural grammar that makes it possible. This is you commit to all of this sort of as a package deal, not only what you see, but how you are seeing it. And that becomes almost how you're seeing it becomes completely transparent, and what you're seeing becomes indistinguishable from reality itself to you. All of that is the case. However, on the other hand, right, I can look back at other times in our culture. I can, right, look at Taoism and Buddhism. So there is something in me, and this has to be the case if you think about it. There has to be something in me that is pre-cultural and also transcultural that allows me to do that. It allows me to acquire a culture. It allows me potentially to transform and move into another culture to varying degrees, almost completely. Some people move from one culture to another and they completely enculturate, right? So you have to note that there is this tremendously situatedly powerful variation due to our historical cultural cognitive grammar, but there's also deep continuity. Let me give you an analogy for this, and I'll play it out. There are universal mechanisms of evolution that produce all of the variations we see across the context. Evolution doesn't say what it's going to produce is the same, right, organism. In fact, what it does is the opposite. It just keeps producing more and more kinds of organisms, right? The process is universal. The product is, right, is pluralistic, right? But you'll also note that within, so there's a universal process, right? So it doesn't mean I can't talk about these different different forms of adaptivity, whether or not it's biological or cognitive. All I need is, well, yes, but there has to be a universal process of adaptivity. And then when I do that, I can also say, and then there's another form of continuity. So in addition to this tremendous variation, which you've mentioned, and I agree with, there, right? And in addition to, it's all due to a universal process, like we've talked about, this mechanism of evolving relevance realization, of mediating between home and horror, which you're calling order and chaos, like what Jordan does, right? But there's also perennial problems, right? This is why you get homologies in evolution, why you get, why does the ichthyosaur and the porpoise, why do they look so much the same? They're totally different and totally different. Well, because there are perennial features of certain kinds of environments that present perennial problems. We face perennial problems. We face perennial problems of self-deception, of disconnection, of polarization, etc. So what I'm trying to get at is, I think a kind of, and I don't think you were saying that, I'm not attributing it to you, but the fact that our cultural cognitive grammars are so powerful does not license cultural relativism, because that there are still universal processes that need to be understood and presupposed and explored. And also there are tremendous aspects of convergence because of perennial problems. And that's why the evolutionary analogy, I keep coming back to it, because I happen to believe, like many people in 4E cognitive science, like my friend and colleague Evan Thompson, his teacher Francisco Varela, there's a deep continuity between the way cognition works in order to fit itself to the environment and the way biology works in order to fit itself to the environment. Sorry, that was a long answer, but you posed a long, tremendous.
No, it was a great answer. And it just makes me think, I mean, what then is the role of a type of biological geographical determinism in a sense, so if we say that there's these fundamental underlying ways of awareness reaching out for things, and based on the environment, it will reach out and grasp and hold and use those things differently. And, if we look at world history, right, the environments available to, again, let's use our friends in the Amazon basin, for example, versus those in the Fertile Crescent, 20,000 years ago are vastly different. Climate, beasts of burden, agriculture, all that kind of stuff. And so a different, like that impulse, that reflex, however we want to call it, the one that's trying to map the world properly or optimally, is highly dependent on the world that it's attempting to map itself to.
Sure.
And so I keep coming back to this question myself, like, what is the role of culture? On the one hand, and again, I don't want to beat a dead horse, but I keep coming back to, when I look at the religious enterprise, for all of its issues, and we'll get into maybe what comes, what new form it may take in, from here on out. But I do think there's, if they're trying to determine the best way to engage reality, and part of that process was observing, let's say, being oriented by different values, and how then that mechanism of mediation is constituted. And then over many, many years, kind of determining, like, well, these are the ones that are best to have at the top, so that the hierarchies of value and therefore perception and behavior are most properly or optimized for grappling with that reality. Then in my mind, that obviously says something about the reality that it's trying to grasp, right? It says something that, and maybe that's kind of the idea of God. Like when we say that these values are mapping to that reality in such a way that adhering to those values or being oriented by them leads to quote unquote success. And I understand that may be somewhat of a difficult thing to nail down, but let's say individual success and collective harmony optimized, let's say, if you're like, it doesn't seem irrational whatsoever to me to make that inference, to say, well, if being led by these values for that mechanism of grafting onto reality lead to the best outcomes, then something that parameterizes or characterizes the reality that we're engaging with must be resonant with those values. And if you want to call that God, then I don't have a huge issue with it, because it is the thing that determines, or if this assertion is correct, it would be the structure, the values, the forces, whatever you want to call them, that do determine outcomes of the mediatory process, of the attempt to map onto it. So
can I respond to that? Because that's really important. And this is not meant to categorize you or pigeonhole you or just label you. I don't like dismissal by labeling. I think that's one of the problems in our culture right now, the way we're interacting. So instead, I see this kind of argument emerging. Jordan made that argument. I've seen the argument made in many other places. And my meta argument, my argument about the argument is this: we have this often starts to resemble an actual historical example, right? And so here's the basic idea. I'll try, I'll call intelligibility that property that we're talking about, intelligibility is the world can make sense to me, and it can increasingly do so. And culture depends on this. Culture ratchets up. I don't have to relearn everything from scratch. That's why culture is so powerful at adaptation. You don't have to start from scratch the way the baby gazelle does. You start from all of this given to you, ready to go, right? Like you didn't invent English, I assume, right? And just as a clear and obvious example. Okay. Yeah. Now, what it depends on is that sense, and then right. Oh, wait. There's always a moreness. The intelligible, always, right. We can get it wrong, but it unfailingly leads to more intelligibility and more intelligibility and more intelligibility, and we start to get this sense of a through line, right? That through all, and it's like it's similar to this. Like notice how you can never see all of an object. You never see all of its, you can't see all, because the number of aspects on it are, it's combinatorially explosive, uncountably large, right? And nevertheless, what you do is there's something running through all those aspects that isn't yet another aspect. It's what makes all the aspects possible, but it's not itself an aspect. Is that making sense to you, just in your phenomenology? Right. Mm-hmm. And so now, instead of doing that for the intelligibility of one thing, do it for intelligibility as an all. Intelligibility keeps doing, and there's this through line, right? That's going through all of the right. There's this moreness, but the moreness seems to how we make more sense, and how it follows from how we've previously made sense makes sense to us, right? And so you start to get this, and then you get this idea that by looking at the structure, the history, or the structure of the history of intelligibility, we will actually get a trajectory sense. We'll be able to trace the through line and get a sense of what it points to. Now, and you can see various people doing this, and they're typically the grand synthesizers like Plotinus or Maximus or Hegel. But here's the idea: for all of their differences, there's this sort of Neoplatonic idea that if I can do this really carefully, if I can really carefully reflect on the dynamic structures of intelligibility, that will ultimately disclose the depths of reality to me as much as is possible for any human being. And what that means is there's something that is right doing this. It's integrating synchronically my intelligibility, but it's also integrating in the through line. This is kind of like, the rhythm and the melody and then the harmony. You can almost like a musicality, if you'll allow me that metaphor. There's a musicality to an intelligibility, and like music, it reaches into the depths of me and into the depths of the world or reality, and binds them together in a profound mutual participation. And the idea of Neoplatonism is that we can very carefully contemplatively, discursively, dialogically trace out and try to more and more conform to this musicality of intelligibility, and that will disclose the source of all of this, right? And the idea is there's some kind of constant integration happening synchronically and diachronically. It points to a deep oneness, source of oneness. Now, the point is, historically, Neoplatonism, and I think Arthur Voss Lewis is right about this, Neoplatonism is the grammar of spirituality in the West. I think that's just indubitable. You take a look, whenever the religions try to become deeper, right, and they try to articulate their depths, they turn to Neoplatonism. You see it in Christianity, you see it in Islam with Sufism, you see it in Judaism with Kabbalah. And then Thomas Plant has argued, if you take a look at the Silk Road that connects Rome to China, they have different religions, different philosophical views, but Neoplatonism is the intellectual Silk Road. It's the thing that's being used to give a common space of thought so they can talk to each other, not only trade things, but trade ideas with each other. And so I'm not saying we can go back to Neoplatonism. That's not what I'm saying. But what I'm saying is we have good historical examples that this project that you're putting your finger on, that we can do individually and collectively, is like, let's, if you allow me the metaphor, let's really learn to listen and appreciate, like music appreciation, the musicality of our intelligibility within, right, synchronically and diachronically. And that will disclose this sort of oneness of ultimate, and notice, remember, the oneness is not another aspect. It's not another thing. It's what binds all possible aspects together. I think that is what is happening today, a kind of post-nominalist, after the three R's, scientific revolution, Reformation, Renaissance, revival of Neoplatonism. I think that's happening right now. And you probably wouldn't even have thought of it that way. And I'm not trying to pigeonhole you. I'm trying to say that I'm trying to take heart, because this project has been, I think, done well, right? Both within the West, whatever that's supposed to put a circle around, and also between the West and the East, again, whatever that's supposed to put a circle around. And we have really good evidence that we are capable of, this is what I like to say, we are capable of replacing the courtroom of debate with the courtyard of Dialogos, where something like this, right, this revived or reformed Neoplatonism disposes the furniture of thought so that we can all talk deeply together without having to crush or defeat the other side. Sorry, but what you're saying there was just, I think it's really, really important. And so if you look at classical theology, like God and the one of Neoplatonism are virtually identified repeatedly, again, across the Abrahamic religions. And also there's a relationship between the one and, maybe Brahman or the Tao, like this is constantly happening, right? I think that this is a very viable project, and it's not just an intellectual philosophical project in the academic sense. This is a project whereby we can mutually, right, come into the courtyard of Dialogos, in fact, and afford the individual and collective cultivation of wisdom. And the fact that there is something that makes the constitution of that courtyard continually available to us and continually in contact with reality realizing itself. And if we want to call that God, I'm fine with that. I'm fine with that. Yeah. Sorry, but that was a long speech, but you introduced God and that, right? You got to,
I know, I just kind of dropped it in there, but I'll explain myself a bit now. And to your point, you needn't ever preface anything by, apologizing and anything like that, because this is actually what we're doing, right? I hope we are in the courtyard of Dialogos. And you know what's awesome? There's something so fulfilling about these exchanges. I'll just pause where we're going, conceptually with this for a second. And just, part of the reason that I enjoy doing this so much at this point in time is, and I mean, this speaks to the gravity or relevance of it itself, right? Because you get a sense you're inching closer to something of extreme value.
Yes.
And even if you'll never attain it, right? Because we said we'll never arrive at maybe that still completed point, but just the journey of inching closer to it. And I'm not like, I try not to be too hyperbolic, and I don't mean this even necessarily as an intellectual pursuit. The intellectual pursuit is a means to some ineffable, graceful feeling that is amplified the further you pursue this. And there's nothing like it, there's really nothing like it. So, but what I wanted to say in response to what you're saying, I mean, I agree. And I used perhaps terminology that lended itself to, Judeo-Christian ideas and traditions and things like that. But as you alluded to, I mean, whether we're talking about Brahman or the Tao, I mean, I guess my point was simply that conforming to the way, and the reason why that conveys advantage or success says something about the way itself, right? I mean, that's kind of the assumption. And one, I guess, part of our enterprise is to try to interpret the way, or God, or Brahman, or what have you, and to try to figure out how we conform most closely to that in thought and perception and action. And, I've had, and I feel like this is the case for you as well, I think you call it, which I'd never come across the term before, but I really like it, a pure consciousness event. I think that's what you refer to it as. Or
That's
you could call
it,
you could call it a mystical experience. You could call it the ineffable. I use, and we all know that these are impossible to articulate with words, so it all sounds silly on a certain level, but I tend to refer to it as complete union with the fullness of the present moment, something like that. And in those moments, it's almost like perhaps you unify with, or you get as close as is possible to the way, to Brahman, to God, something like that. But then those experiences dissipate, and you're more in your normal waking consciousness, let's say. And I guess part of the thing that I'm trying to determine is what degree of influence should that experience and the insights and the knowledge and wisdom that may come from them inform, quote unquote, day-to-day life and activity. How should we go about generating a clarity around right action, or the rightest action, let's say? How do we take that and put it into normal life such that it feeds into that cultural mechanism? Because the other point is that cultural mechanism can be extremely advantageous, or it can be extremely detrimental.
Totally.
Someone that someone that I used to listen to a lot, and he's a very interesting person, to say the least, but Terence McKenna used to say, like, culture is not your friend, right? I know what he's saying, right? Because the corruption and all the deficiencies of culture can, as we were saying before, it can cause you to commit to the wrong things. It can narrow your attention improperly. But if the culture is properly constituted, and this gets into an interesting discussion about how culture becomes properly constituted, and we definitely want to put a pin in that and come back to it. But if it is properly constituted, then that mechanism is all the more improved in terms of what it can deliver to you, in aiding you in making those commitments and narrowing the perception optimally, such that what it returns to you is better than it could be otherwise. So I'd love to get your take on those 2 points, and then we can maybe do the culture thing afterwards.
Excellent. Again, I want to pause, and again, I'm really appreciating the finesse of thought you're bringing to this. Like, I really am. It's like the dance of Dialogos and the aesthetics and beauty of it matter to me as much as the content. And so, just
something to be said there.
Right. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Well, you're welcome. So by the way, if you want me back, I'm coming back. So,
good, sold you.
So I want to pick up on something you said first, and then use it to answer the second part of what you said. So notice you said, like, we're always inching, and there's some value. We sense some value in. I want to point out to something, and this is just something John Rusin talks about. That notice we understand this in practice, that we evaluate somebody's knowledge claims, not just in terms of what they've said, right? But we also sort of gauge it in terms of their maturity, right? So I don't place the same epistemic demands on a 5-year-old as I would on a 30-year-old. We would say, that's ridiculous. What are you doing? Right? What are you doing? I don't place the same epistemic demands on somebody who hasn't received a certain formal education as people who have a formal education or in that particular arena. And this is a point that's well noted, but now notice what does maturation mean? And notice it picks up on something you said there. You said we're going through this process where we're continually conforming ourselves to the way. I'll use that term. That's nice, right? Because the way means both a method by which we do it and also the way things unfold. And right, we're trying to get a conformity of ways. My way and the way of being are come into conformity, right, with each other. They're faithful to each other. So notice that there's a kind of change in knowing that isn't the accrual of just propositions, right? You can teach a 10-year-old all kinds of propositions about romantic relationships. They could perhaps learn the Kama Sutra better than you know it. But until you've made love and until you've done it with, multiple times with responsive partner or partners, you don't understand it. You have to mature into it. We understand this. This is why we rightly say, adults shouldn't have sex with children. Because of that, we understand, no. Maturity means a lot to love, and your capacity for understanding it, your capacity for entering into relationship with that aspect of reality is bound to your level and degree of maturation. What this means is deeply that there are truths that are available to us only as we are constantly maturing. And what do we mean by that? We mean transforming our ongoing conformity to reality. That's how Rusin actually came down to define. What do we mean when we say to somebody, be more mature? We mean turn and orient to the way things are. That's what we're advocating. And we're demanding for people, and you can't say you're done. And think about what I'm saying is wisdom is just the call to continual maturation is as many of the dimensions of your ability to fit reality as you possibly can. So there is a knowing that comes through transforming. There are truths that are disclosed to you only by you undergoing a process of deep transformation. And we have lost that. We lost it in the idea, no, we can just get a method. And the method doesn't require that I undergo any other transformation other than learning the method. Maybe it's a calculation method. Maybe it's this kind of scientific method, right? And that will give me everything I need. No. What you're talking about is that there are types of truths that are only disclosable through transformation. And this is a perennial claim made across all the different religions and, wisdom traditions. It's like, no, like you're not done. Right? If you think you're done with wisdom, you're fundamentally foolish. Now, right? That to me also gives me what I need to answer your second point is how do we properly coordinate these moments of transcendence, of self-transcendence that seem to call for and afford deep self-transformation? Because one thing you can do, right? You can have those moments, you can just turn away from them, right? Or your culture is useless, and this is what's happening to a large degree of the population. You have these experiences, and you don't have a framework to help you make sense of them, right? And so you wander around, and you either go down some rabbit hole, you spin, or maybe you luckily meet somebody. And like I talk to enough people to see this happening all over the place, right? But this is the proper role. This is another way of talking about the proper role of wisdom. Wisdom is that which properly mediates between self-transcendence and self-transformation. When you're engaged in the project of self-transformation, wisdom calls you into the needed self-transcendence in order to engage in the self-correction. You can't engage in profound self-correction unless you engage in self-transcendence. They are one and the same. You're just using two different words for the same thing. Right? So wisdom, when you're in transformation calls you to self-transcendence, but wisdom also calls you from self-transcendence back into self-transformation. Like Rilke's great poem, right? He sees the bust of the sculpture of Apollo, and he's going through it and how beautiful it is, and it's just, he's having this incredible mystical experience. And then what's the final line of the poem? You must change your life. You must change your life. Wisdom says, how do I take that, and how do I transform my life? What I'm trying to get you to say is wisdom constantly calls you from self-transformation into needed moments of self-transcendence, and it calls you from those needed moments into how you actually transform your life in a reliable and in a broad sense rational way. This is Plato's parable of the cave, and people often stop in the wrong point in the parable, right? Yes, people ascend out of the cave, and they see more and more the reality, the real patterns, until they see the sun that is the source of. That's not where the parable ends. The person goes back down into the cave and tries to, right, transform that world, right? Wisdom, another way of thinking of wisdom, is it's this thing that is mediates. It calls us from self-transformation into self-transcendence, and calls us from self-transcendence into self-transformation. And if a culture is oriented towards giving a priority to wisdom, a culture will properly help people to constantly navigate the ascent and the return.
Beautifully put. This maybe tension's the wrong word, but I mean, I guess I bring up the question in the first place because there's some degree of something has not been reconciled, I guess, properly in my mind yet between the transcendent experience and then, like, let's say the lift wood, carry water sort of thing, where you're the Godhead and then you're just a meat sack. And what's the proper relationship there? And I think, sometimes it's too easy to say, well, the ultimate endpoint is, of course, that transcendent, ineffable experience, because it seems like there's nothing more apex to human consciousness. And is that not what we're striving for? And then, I mean, of course, even practically, you could take that down, because you say, well, you're not going to get very far if you're the Godhead all the time. If you're just pure
Yeah.
selfless consciousness, then your individuated form is probably not going to fare too well. So what should be the relationship between them? And I think you provided some good insight there. But it's still, I mean, sometimes I look at it, and this is purely like a visual conceptual aid, but sometimes I think of it as an origin point, and maybe, you could say there's an origin point, and then there's like a Merkle tree, or like I don't know if you know what that is, but several different, shoots of a tree ad infinitum that go out from there. And that's your perception, experience of the world, and all the different things that encounters based on kind of where its origin point is, gently always is kind of moving it around and nudging it and trying to find the most proper fit, as we were kind of alluding to earlier. And it may be the case, just to, perhaps a theory, that these ineffable experiences make it easier or give you greater degree of confidence of around where that center or origin point should be, in order to determine action. And then you test that by saying, well, if true, what kind of feedback and responses am I getting from all of these interactions further down the tree, let's say? And, maybe some experiences only nudge it gently and say, this, but others, experiences of awe or wonder or spontaneous transcendence, what have you, maybe they nudge it grossly. And this is kind of the same idea of this never-ending enterprise of creeping towards something. It's almost like you could reframe it in a never-ending enterprise of trying to hone in on the most proper origin point or center within yourself. And so that I guess is one of the ways, because it's even difficult to articulate how I'm managing this relationship, but that's probably one of the ways that I'm contextualizing the transcendent with everyday life, and trying to determine, and I'll use a very perhaps it may not be a valid comparison, but if you, and I haven't studied too in depth like the various sages of the past, but various Buddhist or various forms of Hinduism or Taoism or Zen, like the sage is always, they're the one who got it right. They kind of hang out in that transcendence, and even if they come back into normal life and culture, they're kind of always the sage. Like that's kind of,
Yeah.
They don't become a normal person again, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And that may be the wrong way to put it, but I guess the question is still, what do we do with that transcendent experience? And I think this is part of what we're trying to determine here, like what kind of a culture emerges from the proper relationship with that transcendent experience. And as you said, the elevation or the prioritization of wisdom is definitely a part of that. And that gives us perhaps an architecture or a scaffolding by which to help answer and mediate these questions. But I don't know, maybe riff a bit more on that. If
I want to, because I want to argue there's a deep continuity, a cognitive continuum, if you will, between these moments of awe and wonder and just your everyday cognition. And so I want to take your image of the tree and maybe play with it a little bit, and go back to like the guts of deep learning in the wake sleep algorithm of Jeffrey Hinton, and out of machine learning. It goes, what is that? Just give me a sec.
Sure.
Okay. So what you can see is, and this is what I argued with like Tim Lillicrap and Blake Richards and I in a paper we published in 2012. What you can see is a deep analog within deep learning, or at least the wake sleep algorithm of the evolutionary process. So the network just picks up a bunch of stuff and it doesn't know what's noise and what's signal. It's trying to figure out some pattern in the environment. What does it do? Right. First, what it does is it does a kind of a data compression. What data compression, like just for maybe some listeners who might not, you were probably taught in high school, you get a scatter plot, right? And then what you do, you draw a line of best fit. So you're losing all the specific data because you're trying to find the invariant pattern, because you're trying to interpolate and extrapolate. That allows you to generalize. That allows you to predict. That's why we do that in science. It's not just that we like pretty lines, right? There's a deep function. That's data compression. And so what I'm doing is I'm trying to almost like when you're squeezing a sponge, I'm trying to squeeze all the noise out, all the irrelevant, and can I find some invariant pattern underneath all of this, right? And then so you do the compression. Do you stop there? No. Now what you do is the system generates variations, and it goes out and right, and then it picks up again on all these different, and then it does the compression, and then it does the variation and the compression. You see what the compression is doing? It's pulling out, trying to get deeper and deeper invariance, and then when it does this, what we call the particularization, it's trying to pick up on what is contextually specific, on all the variance in the environment, because reality is made up about this relationship between variance and invariance. And what it does is it goes compression, variation, compression, variation, and it's constantly evolving its fittedness. Here's what I put to you. Those moments of awe are deep, deep compression. And we're doing this all the time. If you look at your brain, you're constantly what's called self-organizing criticality. You have at all levels of analysis, scales of analysis, you'll have groups of neurons, they suddenly get in synchrony and they're doing data compression, and then they break apart. They go asynchronous, and that's where they're opening up for the variation. And then they compress and compress at multiply recursive levels, right? By the way, the flexibility of that corresponds to how intelligent you are. At least there's good evidence for that. Now, so that's happening at all scales. And so the moment of transcendence is just maybe the conditions are right. You've prepared the right skills, right? You've got compression. That's why it's oneness. I see that. I can't even speak it, but there's this underlying through line oneness. It's the massive compression. But if you stick in the compression, right, you've lost the point of the compression. The point of the compression is to now I can more deeply deal with the variation. But that you don't stop there either, and so that's happening in all of your cognition. Now, notice how that comes up in these little moments. You can have little aha moments of insight. You go, right. I shouldn't be thinking of just the results of this project. I should be thinking of the process. I'm talking to my members of my group, and we're all focused on the goal, and we're not valuing the process. Oh, I shouldn't be so stupid. We have those moments all the time. And what have you just done, right? You broke out of an inappropriate frame. I need to incorporate some variance, and then you recompressed it back down. That's an insight. When you chain a bunch of insights together so they afford each other and accelerate the experience of insight, when you take one aha and get it to prime another aha, that's the flow experience. When you flow, not because you're playing hockey or dancing, but when you flow in your attempt to get that optimal grip on reality, that's wonder and awe and even a mystical experience. But it's a continuum all the way through. What I'm trying to say is you have to see the self-transcendence, these grand moments into profound self-transformation as completely on a continuum with the micro moments of your day-to-day thought. It's the same grammar all the way through.
I understand. And I like how you put that. When you just referred to the emergence of an insight, right? Like an aha, like, oh, I was thinking about something this way and it should be that way. It's not necessarily you determining that you should aha yourself, right? So what is ahaing you when that occurs?
Oh, that's a great question, right? And so you can't infer your way into, like, you can do inference to get you to a place where an aha occurs, but you can't argue yourself to an aha as a conclusion, right? So what's really interesting is, again, it has to do with sort of these two dimensions we've been talking about, paying attention and transformation, right? So what you're basically doing in aha is you're playing with your attention in a way in which you're trying to get two things happening. You're trying to play with your attention in a way that helps break up an inappropriate frame, and then that throws you into the machinery of the very dynamic, self-organizing machinery that is driving your entire cognition. So what you do is, if you'll allow me to speak sort of metaphorically, you have this structure, you break it, and then you throw the pieces into the whirlwind of the dynamics of your self-organizing cognition, and it puts together an alternative frame, and then you see if it fits. And when that, and you can even see sort of a shift between the left and the right hemispheres, and sort of Ian McGilchrist stuff happening. And that's what's going on. So you don't make an insight, you don't receive an insight, you participate in an insight, just like you participate in making love to somebody.
And are there certain prerequisites that can be altered to facilitate that more? Like, let's say you break up those pieces, you throw them into the void and see what comes back. I mean, first, of course, it begs the question, like, why does the void have that? Even if it's not doing the organization itself, as you said, it's a participatory thing. Why is it participating with you? On what basis is it able to?
Okay. So a couple of things there. One is, again, one of the things you're doing is you're having faith in, you're being, and you're relying on the faithfulness of that dynamic relevance realization machinery that we've been talking about. And it's got an evolutionary, like, not just biological evolution, it's got an evolutionary history within your history of your cognitive enterprise. So you're basically saying, I trust my relevance realization machinery, right? Now, what can you do to afford? There's lots of things you can do. You can engage. What are the things that are predictive of insight and flow is mindfulness practice. Again, the West has tended to really reduce what that has meant. And so when people hear mindfulness, they hear just seated meditation, and then they use the words contemplation and meditation as if they're synonyms, and that shouldn't be done. But in a meditative practice, what you base, I'll use my standard analogy. We've talked a lot about framing. Here's the framing, like the frame of my glasses. It's what I can pay attention to, and what's outside my framing I can't see, right? But what do I do as a glasses wearer, right? So take my glasses to be the analogy for my mental framing. Sometimes I step back and pay attention to my glasses rather than paying attention through them. I pay attention to them rather than through. Why do I do that? To see if there might be some defect, deformation, some gunk, cluttering, it's distorting my ability to see. That's what you're doing in meditation. You're stepping back and trying to pay attention to your mental framing. But how do you know that you've transformed it? How do you know you've cleaned your glasses? You have to put them back on. You have to put them back on and see if you can see more clearly and deeply into reality. That's what contemplatio means. It's a translation for the Greek word theoria, where we get our word theory from, because theory means to see more deeply into reality. And you have to go back and forth between them. You have to practice contemplation. Is my contemplation, well, maybe it's being distorted by something. Oh, there is a distortion. Meditation. Now, have I removed it? Right. Now I see more deeply. And you have to do that looping. You have to practice that loop. You have to do meditation and contemplation. That will enhance the potential for your aha. But you also have to enrich, right? The landscape that yourself, your salience landscaping is running across. What do I mean by that? Right? If you take a look at people who have the most profound insights, they tend to be on the boundaries between disciplines. Right? They have a rich ecology. They've built very complex, right, structures of intelligibility. Because when I'm on this nexus, I do this as a cognitive scientist, right? And if that's a shameless promotion for cognitive science, I don't care, right? Because as a cognitive scientist, I'm trying to, right, get psychology and neuroscience and linguistics and computer science, right, and philosophy to all talk to each other well. And so what am I constantly doing? I'm on that nexus point, and I'm enriching all the variation by learning all the home disciplines, but I'm also practicing interdisciplinary compression. What's the through line? And then back out and back in and back out. So I can practice mindfulness to enhance the cognitive flexibility. Then I can enrich the dynamics of my knowledge of what I know and how I know to afford the most comprehensive kinds of insights.
I mean, is it fair to say that through line, I mean, can truth be determined by the degree to which the through line allows for clarity or understanding or connects to the most things, something like that?
I would say both, because if we prioritize just the clarity and the coherence, we're back to the polarizing that we were talking about earlier. I think, right, the truth is, in that sense, and this is why the truth should be sacred to us. The truth is that which is always, like the way I was talking about being on that point between the discipline, right? I'm on that point where the inexhaustible mystery of reality is constantly there, almost ominously. So there should be an ominous dimension to truth. But that moreness is always also a shining into of intelligence. That's what phenomenon means. It means shining into. So when I'm like this, right, things are shining into me. They're being intelligible to me. But, and this is Heidegger's great point, but that's only because there's an inexhaustible mystery from which they can shine. And I think what truth is a sense when we're getting both of that. We're getting how it shines into the suchness of this thing, and right, but also the moreness, right? When you're getting both the homing and the horizon of horror, right? When it's right, when you get a sense of this way of framing is making things clear, but simultaneously making things mysterious to me. And there's no contradiction. There's no dissonance in that. They perfectly belong together. That for me is the way in which I think we are phenomenologically experiencing the sense of truth, or at least the sense of realness. I want to say one more thing for that, just please, right? We have a hermeneutics of suspicion that is becoming prevalent in our culture. The hermeneutics of suspicion says appearances are deceptive, they're distorting, they're deceiving. We get that from Marx and Freud, Nietzsche, Derrida, and there's truth to that. Appearances can be distorting, they can be deceiving, they can be distracting. But here's the thing we forgot, and this is one of the parts that I think Merleau-Ponty does so well. any moment where you go, oh, wait, I was deceived, that's an illusion, is dependent on a more primordial moment of, and this is real. Real and illusion are contrastive terms. You can't say one thing is an illusion without asserting something else is real. To say that everything is an illusion makes no sense. It's like saying everything is tall. Like, what does that mean? It doesn't mean anything. It sounds like you're saying something, but you're not saying anything. The hermeneutics of suspicion, while useful, is always absolutely dependent, and this is D.C. Schindler's work, on the hermeneutics of beauty. What is beauty? Not what we've turned beauty into, which is, as Hans says, the smoothness that makes us feel comfortable. That's not what beauty is. If you read ancient thinkers on beauty, like Plotinus, beauty is distressing, because beauty is when the appearance is not distracting us or distorting, it's disclosing the reality. So we're getting the shining in from an ungraspable moreness. When you go, that's a beautiful, like when you, oh, wow, that's beautiful. There's so much more. Yeah, and yet it's also so clear to me at the same time. That's the hermeneutics of beauty. That's why beauty and truth belong together. It doesn't mean they're identical.
It's kind of like, there's a rapture in your perception when you encounter beauty, perhaps something like that.
Yeah,
It makes me think you'll probably know the person who I should attribute this quote to, and I can't even remember the full quote, but it ends in like infinity in an hour. You know that one? It's like when
to see a world in a grain of sand, and heaven in a wildflower, to hold infinity in the palm of your hand, and to spend eternity in an hour. It's William Blake.
Yes, that's what you were just saying makes me think of.
And notice how the transcendent is brought into the specific suchness of the grain of sand. He's picking a grain of sand because he's wanting you to see that there's a point that everything, this is a watch, right? And that's its categorical identity, but it has a suchness. It has a non-categorical here and nowness, itselfness that makes it what it is, and beyond my ability to categorize, and that's its suchness and it's shining. But it's also the moreness. Remember the moreness that I pointed to, like all the and when I get that, and whoa, the unique suchness and the non-categorical unique suchness, and yet the almost universal moreness that is pouring into this. That is how we should properly understand beauty. At least that's what I would argue. And the hermeneutics of beauty should be reprioritized over the hermeneutics of suspicion. Don't dispense with the hermeneutics of suspicion. We need it, but it is pretentious in the deep critical sense of that word to treat the hermeneutics of suspicion as primary and primordial. That is false.
There are three things off the back of that I want to just, quickly throw back at you. One, what do you do with the availability of that type of perception to things? Let's, maybe rapture is not the right word, but if you have that type of perception where somehow you're getting the full relationship and extent of both, how is that to influence behavior? And then the other thing is, like, I think I like the way that you mentioned that truth is always in contrast, right? It's like truth is, I think I've characterized it this way before, but perhaps one way to start dancing around a definition of truth may be the thing that's beneficially contrasted to the most things, to all others. Like maybe that's how you, in some ways, discover it. And the third thing is, you say, when you throw, just to go back about 5 minutes, when you throw those bits and pieces of your former perception or idea or whatever into the void of your own self, you're trusting the relevance machinery to some degree, right?
Yes.
And what relationship does that action, be it conscious or subconscious, have with the notion of faith, whereby because there's some that trusting of the relevance machinery to orient and help determine your behavior. It seems like there's some relationship between the two.
Those are all great questions. So please put a note in them, because if I lose a thread, I want to be able to pick, I want to answer all of these, and I want to try and answer them integrated. So the last one is, remember that relevance realization is like adaptivity. It's not in you. It's not in the world. It's an ongoing relationship. It's like, and the analogy I use, it's like, and I prefer like talking about faithfulness rather than faith, the way I'm faithful to my partner. It's not that I have a finished set of beliefs or all the skills I need to deal with them. If I try to do that, I'm doomed in my relationship. I got you. We're done. Right. That's not what it means. It means, right. No, that I have a sense of a through line that I can afford her self-transcendence, self-transformation, and she can afford mine, and that we're reciprocally bound to that. So this is why a lot of the metaphors for faithfulness in the Bible are metaphors of sexual intercourse, right? Because it doesn't mean you're doing one thing or even it means you're not trying to get cognitive closure, you're trying to maintain continuity of contact, right? And so the relevance realization machinery, and I mean this deeply, is being co-created by my embodied brain and the environment and the world. Now, if you say, but couldn't all of that be an illusion? If it is, I don't care, because again, I don't know what it means to say everything's an illusion. If you're saying that this is all somehow false, and even my thought of that is false, and I can't get out, I don't care about that, because you're saying that it's impossible for me to ever know that it's that kind of grand, all-comprehensive illusion. That doesn't make any sense, right? Mm-hmm. So, because can I disprove to you that, can I show you that absolute skepticism, absolute solipsism of the absolute specious present is false? No, because you can always claim, well, it could be that it's just me all by myself and everything else is a projection of my mind, and even my memories of my past are all an illusion, and right, everything, and there's just me and there's no knowledge, and even my self-knowledge is under, like, I can't disprove you. But I take it that doesn't make any ultimate sense. So for me, right, I take it that there is deep continuity of contact, because solipsism and skepticism are in some participatory sense not possible. Now, about what do you do with the beauty, right? Virtue, this is Plato. He doesn't say this, but this is what I would argue he's saying. Virtue is the beauty of wisdom. Virtue is about, right, not just experiencing it or seeing beauty. Virtue is about enacting it. You're always trying to get that sweet spot between the moreness and the suchness of reality. Wisdom is just the optimal enhancement of your relevance realization machinery, right? So think about how even what we call physical beauty or sexual beauty are supposed to help fit us for sexual reproduction, right? And can it be hijacked? Of course, there is no final form, okay? But right, why do we like clear skin? Because it indicates health. Why are we after health? Well, because it is a necessary condition for successful reproduction. So beauty is disclosing something to me. It's helping me optimally fit to the environment. Well, that's what virtue is, but not, you're not fitting for necessarily sexual reproduction. You're trying to fit to, right, the world in the good life. Virtue is the sense, is the beauty of wisdom, in that it's the sense that you are getting more and more optimally fitted to your environment for a good life, individually and collectively. So and this is, the idea is, I'm going to take what you might call perceptual beauty, physical beauty, and this is the Symposium by Plato, and I'm going to use that to, oh, right, and then I'm going to try and pay attention to beautiful lives. What makes a life beautiful? Oh, what makes a life beautiful are these ways of fitting right to yourself, to other people in reality, that sort of produce and protect and promote personhood. Well, what are those ways of fitting that produce and protect and promote personhood, persons within a community? Oh, those are the virtues. And every virtue is just a way of being wise. Being kind is how to be wise in this situation. Being courageous is how to be wise in this situation. Virtue is the beauty of wisdom. And what you might call artistic or sensual beauty is a platform to help lead me and educate me into deeper kinds of beauty, the beauty of good people leading good lives. And if you say, well, why should I want that? What's the justification? I can't justify that to you. Every other justification I do is justified by how it leads to good people leading good lives. There's nothing, well, what should that be for? It shouldn't be for anything. And if you think it should be for anything, I don't think you understand how beauty and right meaning work. That would be my answer. I hope I touched on all three questions.
You did, and I've got more now. So, when we look at that, and I love how virtue is the beauty of wisdom. That's how you articulated it, right?
That's right. That's right.
Yeah, I think that's a great. I as I have familiarized myself with thinkers and spiritual adepts and mystics and stuff throughout the past, and I alluded to the stereotypical sage that, let's say, reaches enlightenment and just stays in the temple, for example. I've come to appreciate that, first of all, we all have all potential within us, right? I mean, we could be a monster, we could be a saint, we could be everything in between.
Yes.
I mean, we have that potential. And so, and we tend to, and to go way back to the start of this conversation, it seems to me that we tend to, based on our cultural and familial and other conditioning that we receive, and then, of course, our own intentional participation in that process, we tend to sort of solidify an identity, right? Because that's useful in operating in the world and providing value, and as a result, sustenance and all that kind of stuff. But then, of course, the danger of that particular process is that you then identify with the identity more so than the thing that's generating the identity, right?
Exactly.
And this is, I don't think this is mind-blowing to anybody, but when I think about mastery, and this will lead into a question more relevant to what you just said, but when I think about mastery, it's the ability to engage or embody the aspect of yourself that's most appropriate for any given moment that you might find yourself in. Now, the reason why that came up in my mind is because I think that's fairly similar to what you just said in terms of the role of wisdom, whereby you embody the right virtue for the right moment, regardless of.
Can I interject just right here? Just one thing. I don't want to disrupt your thoughts, so hold your thought. I just want to say, notice the deep connections between virtue and virtuosity, and also virtual in the sense of that which holds the power of potential, right, and actualizes it, right? And so virtue and virtuosity need to be brought back together again, and that's exactly what I am talking about. So please continue.
That's super interesting, especially the virtuosity point, because that's basically what I'm talking about, right?
Yes, exactly.
But so to me, and I guess to a certain degree, what I've tried to cultivate in my own life is making sure that whatever moment I wind up in, either intentionally or unintentionally, that I can engage an aspect of myself that is most appropriate for that. And of course, to some degree, there can be you can do that absent training, but obviously there's a big component of training there too, right? Like if you need to embody aggression in a certain moment, or if you need to embody wisdom or calmness or astuteness or all this kind of stuff. I mean, these are all different aspects of yourself that you can independently refine and then put on the bookshelf, so that when circumstances dictate that one or another aspect of yourself is required for optimal outcome, you can put it there, and you're not so rigidly attached to a static identity that you're not able to move through those different aspects properly. And the way you just articulated there in regards to wisdom and virtue, I think that's one that I'll integrate into my thinking and articulating of that process in the future.
Aristotle said, it's not about being angry or not being angry. Like we have this prototypical image of the sage as just always calm. He said, it's about being angry at the right time for the right reasons to the right degree.
Right.
Right. And it's the same about love. It's the same about anything, right? It's that relevance realization.
But notice you can't also do that if you're so attached to the static identity, right? I guess that's
exactly. And I wanted to say, notice how what you said about like a network identity, and what I was saying earlier about a network of knowledge in order to afford insight, in order to afford transformation. Those two networks are like they're overlapping in like a profound way. Notice what you want too is, and here I'll use a martial art analogy. You not only want the variety, you want what's called a small world network organization of all of your roles, all of yourselves, all of the constellations of agency that you can bring to bear, right? And you want, like you're right, you want it rich, but you also think about, like, sorry, I use this analogy, like, so, you know, your martial art, you have all these moves you can make, and you want a rich network of that. But you also want, like, so you take the fighting stance. You don't actually use the fighting stance. What am I doing is I'm trying to find a nexus point that allows me to move as best as possible between, right? And this is like a small world network formation between. So I want it organized. And I want hubs and nexus points. So I want to curate it in the deep senses of the word curate, so that I also can move through that, right, network. And what do you want in a network? You want a balance of efficiency, short path distance between any 2 points, and and redundancy, multiple connections, so you can, if one gets broken, right? And that's a small world network. It's doing relevance realization. You also want to, and this is what religions do, because religions are primarily about transforming the self. I think McNamara is right about that, right? What you want is, you want yourself to be a dynamic, right, small world network organization, so that you have not only the richness, but you all that robustness, that flexibility, but you also have the ability to quickly and effectively move transformatively between the points. And in really profound ways, religions help to build that small world nexus of the self. And we are at a loss in our attempts to try and replace that with the machinery we have available to us right now.
I think,
John, I'm going to have to go soon. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I know. We'll shut it down, because I know you got to stop on your time. So we'll have to pick this up. But I just want to finish off perhaps with this to piggyback on what you just said. And I think this goes back to what we were discussing about the utility and necessity of the experience or knowledge or appreciation of the selfless component of the self.
Yes.
Because
yes,
you know, a lot of fighters in particular will say that, you know, UFC or what have you, will say that fighting is like 90% psychological. And my interpretation of what that means applies to what we've just been discussing, in that
yes,
the degree to which you allow the vestiges or the remaining, the way that you allow an element of the static identity of the self to interrupt the embodiment of one of those other aspects or grooves, will detract from its utility in the moment you're trying to deploy it. So having an ability to recognize the selfless, so that when needed, you can fully, not 50%, not whatever, fully move into the aspect required, that, and not be interrupted by the self. I think that can, you know, that's the rub, right? That's why, that's, you know, perhaps one of the primary utilities of having an appreciation for the selfless aspect of the self.
Yeah. And also for the non-thingness, the no-thingness aspect of the self, the I, to use James' distinction, the I that is never observed but only observes, and it moves through the imaginal space of all the me's, and the I is no me. It's like the through line that is not any particular aspect. The I is that through line that's running through all the different aspects of yourself. And if you try and make it another aspect and lock it down, you've lost the through line, you've lost the function. Exactly. I exactly agree.
John, this has been great, man. I'll let you go. And I feel like we've got some more to discuss. So I'll hit you up, and we'll set something else up for the hopefully near future.
Count on it. I would love to come back and continue this, John. This has been amazing. Very much.
Thank you so much. We'll talk to you soon.